Hey guys, welcome back to my channel today. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing the worst eyeshadow palette that I've ever tried from some of my favorite brands. Now this is kind of like a different spin on the best eyeshadow palette from the brands I love. That's a video that I saw Mel Thompson do first, so I will link her video down below. I'll also link my video with the best eyeshadows from my favorite brands as well if you want to see, but this is a video all about the worst of the worst, the palettes from my favorite brands that really disappointed me. If you guys want to know which palettes to avoid, then just keep watching. The first brand I want to talk about that's actually one of my favorites in the eyeshadow category is Pat McGrath Labs. Pat McGrath has some amazing products, especially her 10-pan Mothership palettes in that rich black lacquer packaging. Some of my favorite color stories from her. The quality as well from her in that regard is beautiful. However, the one palette that I tried that I absolutely did not like from her is actually a palette that I believe is discontinued now. I haven't seen it around in a little while. This palette is sold out on her website right now, so I'm thinking it's probably on its way out, or maybe it's going to get restocked at some point. I'm not sure, but this is the Mothership Sublime Bronze Ambition palette. This is one where the shimmers were so pretty, but some of the mattes were a little bit dry and not so Pat McGrath-like. It was very interesting to me because the 6 pans were the ones that I found some formulation inconsistencies from her brand. It is a cheaper price point product compared to the Mothership 10 pan, but I didn't like that the formula was also not as good. So this is one that I used to have. I do not have it anymore. This is one that disappointed me for sure. And out of all of the Pat McGrath palettes I have tried from her, this was the worst one. Her 10-pan Motherships are still her ultimate product. And you'll see my favorite one from the first video on the best eyeshadow products when you watch that one next. Now the next brand that I want to talk about that I do think is one of my favorite eyeshadow brands of all time is Marc Jacobs. Now the only palette that I can think of that's like drastically different, I think, that's not consistent whatsoever is the Cherrific limited edition palette from this past holiday. I've tried quite a few of the Marc Jacobs ones. I have quite a few in my collection as well, but this one is from this past holiday. It is discontinued now. The Lame shade in this one, you guys, so bad. Pigment payoff was brutal, and there really aren't that many shades in the Marc Jacobs palettes. You really have to make sure every single one of them is good. And when you buy a palette, of course, every eyeshadow should be good, but this is one that was like notoriously bad, like very bad compared to the rest of them. This color story was also heavily cherry kind of, which made sense because of the theme. But to me, it was a little bit redundant. I wish that he had expanded the color story a little bit more as well. When it comes to quality though, this was not one that was a showstopper from the brand, and definitely the worst one I've tried. The next brand of eyeshadow that's one of my favorites is Dior. Now Dior has some beautiful formulations. In particular, the 5 Couleur palettes I think are some of the best. However, they also make some bad ones. The worst palettes I've ever tried from the brand are definitely going to the Triochrome palettes from this past spring 2021 collection. This is when, you guys, you know my struggle when I did this review. It was very difficult to work with these shades. It was so impossible, very dry. I felt like the pigment payoff was brutal. I felt like I could barely work with them. They couldn't blend, they were patchy. There was only 3 shades in each one, and for having such a superior product in the 5 Couleur palettes, it didn't make sense how there was such a drastic shift from the 5 pan, which are amazing, to the 3 pan, which are brutal. I liked the idea and the concept between having 2 shades that are kind of like a really beautiful sheeny color with a beautiful shimmer top coat in the center. I really loved that idea, but in reality, it didn't work out. The only shade that worked was the shimmer shade, which is basically a topper, and it's not worth the price of those to just buy it for the 1 shade. The next brand I want to talk about is Tom Ford. I think Tom Ford does an amazing job at doing his eye quads. I think they're some of the best on the market when it comes to high-end and luxury eyeshadow. However, there is a product that he offers, and this is one that I think I'm going to kind of bend the rules for because I think his quads are actually fairly consistent, at least from my experience with them. All of the ones I've tried have been very consistent, so I couldn't quite pick one from the palettes because I don't think I've tried nearly enough to find a dud yet. There is is the emotion proof eye colors that he's come out with in the recent past. They're terrible. They're brutal, you guys. They're certainly not worth it. It is an eyeshadow product from him, and it's so overpriced for what it is. Creases really, really badly. I think if you prime the lid or you don't prime the lid, they crease really, really bad. For a cream product that's a single color, it has to not be able to crease. I feel like that's just like the one thing they have to do with these. It didn't work. It failed me. So if you want to get a Tom Ford palette, the quads are amazing. My favorites are also listed in that other video I talked about in my best eyeshadow palettes from my favorite brands. The emotion proof eye color though, stay away. Now let's talk about Natasha Denona. This is one of my favorite eyeshadow brands, and this is one brand that I think has taken the cake when it comes to some of the best eyeshadow formulations on the market. One thing about her is she does like to experiment, and she likes to put some new formulations out from time to time, which not always is the best thing. Sometimes as a consumer, you kind of want to come to expect a certain product from someone. If they keep changing it up, it's a little bit of a surprise, not always for the best. This particular launch was not good. This is the Mini Lila palette from Natasha, and this is one of her earlier mini palette releases. Really not good, you guys. Not good at all, especially because it's supposed to pay homage to the Lila OG palette, which is beautiful. Such a beautiful palette, one of my absolute favorites and holy grails for sure. But the Mini Lila, I feel like failed her. Patchy, dry, difficult to work with shades that are not characteristic of Natasha. So this is a mini palette that I think is one of the worst. If this palette is your favorite, or if any other palettes I talk about are your favorites, don't worry, we can still be friends. The next brand I want to talk about that I think is one of the most user-friendly, very beautiful eyeshadow formulations on the market. This is more so mid to high range, and this is Tarte. Now, Tarte is one that I think is, I guess, known for being kind of bland when it comes to eyeshadow. Not super vibrant colors at times, usually more everyday friendly, browns, golds, beiges, pinks, more on the muted side, which I think for a certain makeup customer, this is right up your alley. If you don't want some super loud eyeshadow with tons of shimmer or metallics or things like that, Tarte is very consistent when it comes to releasing beautiful palettes that are perfect for every day. However, Tarte did come out with some duds, and I'm gonna say do not buy a holiday palette from Tarte. This is a brand that cuts corners when it comes to holiday releases. For some reason, their palette's completely made in a totally different area with a totally different formulation. It's often very dry, pigment payoff is very poor. It's so weird because Tarte is so capable of having such a beautiful formulation. My favorite palettes are some of their permanent collection ones. They're just beautiful. The Christmas palettes, please avoid. They also cut corners on the packaging, which obviously isn't the be-all end-all, but packaging is really crap and the formulation inside is brutal too. So when it comes to their holiday launches, just buy one of their permanent collection palettes if you're buying a Tarte palette for a friend, because trust me, they'll appreciate it more. Next, I want to talk about a brand that I think also has an amazing eyeshadow formulation, and this is Anastasia Beverly Hills. Now, one palette that comes out in my head right away as the worst palette I've ever tried from them, it's pretty clear, like it's crystal clear, and I do feel like a lot of us are going to have this exact same thought because I do think this palette was a little bit of a flop for them. Maybe it's your favorite, and if it is, like I said, that's great, but for me, not so much. This is the Subculture palette, and this is one that I saw in like Winners and TJ Maxx like very, very fast after its launch. I don't think the sales were like the other palettes that are amazing, like Soft Glam and Sultry. This one just didn't work. For some reason, when you blended the shadows together, they looked muddy. The pigmentation of the mattes was a little bit dodgy. Some of it was a little bit harder to blend in this palette. Very, very interesting because it came off of beautiful, successful launches from previous palettes. This palette was a dud through and through, and unfortunately, it didn't work out for me. I believe this palette is discontinued now, and I think that's for the best. Next, let's talk about Charlotte Tilbury. Charlotte Tilbury is one of my absolute favorite brands for eyeshadow as well. I do think for the most part she is very consistent, and it was very hard for me to pick out a palette that was the worst one that I've ever tried from her, but I picked it. I picked it. It's actually from last holiday. It is the Super Nudes palette. This is kind of like a matte formula that has a bit of a satinness to it ever so slightly. It's a really interesting hybrid formula from her, but I didn't really think this was a palette that was good on its own. tone. I always felt like I had to use this palette with something else because the shades by themselves, to me, it just wasn't enough. I felt like there was always something missing with my looks. I felt like it was fairly soft and muted for her. I felt like I had to really build up the shades on my eye. If I put certain shades together, it also looked pretty muddy. So this was a palette that wasn't as cohesive with each other as I thought it would be. Definitely a palette that I think some of us do like, so it's all good if you like it, but this is one that out of all the Charlotte palettes that I've tried is definitely my least favorite and has since been decluttered because I really didn't think I was going to use it a ton. When it comes to your favorite brands, what is the worst palette you've ever tried from them? And did it surprise you? Because every time I come across a dud with some of my favorite brands, it surprises me every time. If you haven't seen my best eyeshadow palettes from my favorite brands, then do check that one out. It is linked in the description box. And until my next one, guys, take care and stay safe. Bye, guys.